Hey everybody, it's episode 2 of series 2 of UIO, the podcast for teen girls. Hugs to everyone, and thank you for joining UIO, the podcast for teen girls. It is for you and about you inside out. I am Sonja Lewis, your host. Today we're talking about recognizing mental health problems for what they are, not only in ourselves, but also in those around us. Too often we don't get it, and when we do, we might be too overwhelmed or too embarrassed to act. No wonder mental health problems, small or large, often become a part of norms and wreak havoc on our lives. Today's guest, Eleanor Segall, draws from her personal experience to write about mental health and wellness with an aim to break down stigmas on the topic. Welcome, Eleanor.
Oh, thank you so much.
Well, just thank you so much for being our guest today on UIO. I mean, we're all prone to mental health problems, all of us. We have to admit that. But some groups of people are more vulnerable than others. And sadly, girls are one of those groups. The Children's Society did a study that revealed that a quarter of 14-year-old girls in the UK admitted to self-harm. And this really comes on the back of a UK-wide study called the Millennium Cohort Study. We'll call it MCS, which is tracking the progress of people born in 2000 into adulthood. And that also revealed that teenage girls are particularly vulnerable to mental health difficulties. NHS figures show there were sharp increases between 2005, 2006, and 2015, 2016 in the number of girls under 18 admitted to hospital in England because they had self-harm by cutting. That was up 285%, poisoning up 42%, or hanging themselves 331%. It's all very heavy news and weighs heavily on hearts across the nation. Eleanor, I'm really hoping that this podcast will help to lighten the load, shed some light on the topic, giving girls not only hope for today on the matters, but also hope for tomorrow. It's a big, big subject. And again, we're just very thankful that you're able to be with us this morning to talk about this from your personal experiences, but also bring some expertise to the issue.
My pleasure.
Yeah, you were diagnosed with bipolar disorder at the age 16. And I'm thinking that you likely had some concerns and issues well before the diagnosis. Talk to us about some of the challenges of living with undiagnosed mental illness to begin with, and just some of the pressures that might have led to the illness in the first place.
So I first kind of had symptoms of anxiety from a young age. Probably from about the age of 7, I was quite socially anxious. I grew up with a parent with bipolar disorder, so there was subconsciously a lot going on at home, and I was quite an anxious child. But I would say that when I was about 15 years old is when I started experiencing depression, and I had a year where I wasn't diagnosed, where I had 3 episodes of mental illness in a year. I was taken to see a psychiatrist at 15, which was quite hard. I can still picture myself going up the stairs in my school uniform to see the psychiatrist, and I was quite very, very low. I had to take time out of school. And it sounds strange to say it, but in many ways I was quite lucky because I only had 1 year where I was undiagnosed. A lot of teenagers spend many, many years being really ill, like you mentioned in the survey, self-harming or feeling suicidal, and they don't get the diagnosis. But I had a year where I was depressed for 6 weeks. Then I became hypomanic. So with bipolar disorder, you have cyclical episodes where your moods change. And I became manic, quite hyper, not like myself. And then later that year, I was hospitalized for depression and psychosis. So I had quite an interesting year in 2004 with lots of really difficult, challenging things going on. Yeah. And then I got the diagnosis once I was hospitalized.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it was obviously very difficult for you.
Yeah.
Before we talk about what you were feeling and what you were experiencing, because that's very important, I want to talk about some of the MCS survey, as well as the Children's Society survey, mentioned specific life pressures that could lead to mental and emotional unrest. They mentioned mood disorders, of course. You've talked about depression. I think they mentioned obesity. Talk to us why, what possibly happened in your life, and why are we seeing an increase in mental illness among teens, particularly teen girls?
Okay, so what happened with me, that I believe anyway, is that my dad has bipolar disorder, and he was diagnosed 2 years before I became ill. So part of it, I think, for me personally, was down to genetics. There is some evidence that certain mental health disorders can be passed on. And I had actually a very stable home life. You know, I was shielded from a lot of what went on with my dad, but I do believe I was genetically predisposed. But I think when it comes to teen girls, it's as a teenager, I was lucky, you know, to grow up without social media. I didn't have the same pressures that young girls have today. It almost feels like there's like this kind of non-stop, relentless kind of targeting of young girls and their body image and their self-esteem, and they have to look a certain way, and they can see what their friends are doing all the time. You can't switch off from it, and you're constantly comparing yourself on kind of things like Instagram, for example. I think teenage girls, you know, anyway struggle, and I'm not entirely 100% sure why there is now. It almost feels like an epidemic. I don't know if you'd agree with me, of it's just got so much worse, and it could be the pressures of things that are going on. It could be modern life. It could be a whole host of things, also people's home lives. I think it's important to mention that if you come from a disadvantaged background, or you have experienced a traumatic life event as well, that could be anything. It could be abuse, it could be neglect, or whatever. You're going to experience, you know, more mental health issues. Like I was listening this morning to, I think it was LBC, and someone was saying that their daughter, who's 14, they consistently compare their self-harm scars with their friends.
Yes.
So I think that is a really difficult challenge for young girls today.
Yes, it is a very difficult time. It's a different world. For lack of a better phrase, teenage girls are living in a very fast-paced environment, but they're also exposed to social media. There's wonderful things about social media, but the downside of social media is everything sort of gets perfected, and it gets put in one place, and all the things that you couldn't see, you didn't know about, and this instant gratification about how you look and so forth and so on, about the perfect life, it's at your fingertips. And so I do agree that it does have a large role, but I think it's the pressures that girls face in general, and which is one of the reasons why I wanted to do the UIO podcast, because I think that girls are facing issues, you know, that are just exacerbated now. They're under the spotlight, and lots of things are happening disproportionately. And so, yeah, it does make sense. You mentioned that from your perspective, you think that you were predisposed genetically. Talk to us a little bit about how you must have felt watching your father with an undiagnosed mental illness. You've written about it. You mentioned it as well, that you were pretty protected. But how did you feel? You know, what were some of the challenges for you and the effects of living with a family member with mental illness who had not been diagnosed?
So my dad first got ill, from what I remember, when I was 7. I don't fully have a lot of memories of that, because I think my parents and my grandparents very much tried to shelter me from it. My dad didn't have psychosis. He was never hospitalized, and he suffered from very bad depressions, and then he would also have manic periods as well. For some reason at that age, maybe I subconsciously picked up on it because I was quite anxious, as mentioned, at school, and I found that hard, but we were very, very sheltered from that. The one thing that, you know, my dad had about a 4-year period after that where he was okay. He was still undiagnosed. My home life never felt chaotic. It never felt difficult. The only time that I remember it feeling sort of a bit more kind of stressful is when I was 12 years old. And as you said, I wrote in the Metro about this. So my dad, when I was 12, had a suicidal depression. He was very low. He was not at that point on any medication for bipolar disorder. So I just feel like, he wasn't thinking straight. And my mum found him in the bathroom counting out pills, basically. And he was looking at the pills and thinking, I feel so low and so much pain that I just want this taken away. My dad's very open about mental health, and he kind of said to me that it was us as his children and having a wife, it stopped him from taking them. And then my dad got some help and support after that. My main memory of that is just, my mum saying to me, she found him in the bathroom doing that. And my mum just said that take your sister to my grandparents' house, go to school. She just wanted to, get us out the house so we didn't experience or see it. And in some ways, I'll always be thankful to my mum for that. And I think, I don't know if it affected my own health issues, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
But I was lucky. I think I genuinely feel lucky that I was not affected. I know I've heard of people like the singer Talisa, for example. Her mum, I think, had schizophrenia, and it was just horrendous for her. So luckily I didn't experience that, but yeah.
That's really good. But upon reflection, of course, you were a girl when this happened.
Yeah.
But fast forward to who you are now and all of the writing and putting things in perspective. If a teenage girl were in that position today, how do you cope as a teenage girl if a parent or a guardian or a close family member has this issue? What would you think would be the best thing for a girl to do?
Yeah, I think it's so hard. I think there's two things. Firstly, some teenage girls will be carers for their parents, especially if they come from a single parent background. And I've never experienced that. I always had, my mum was my dad's carer in a sense, so I never had that. I think if you're in that position, reach out to trusted adults, to counsellors, to friends a little bit, but I would say many go through counselling, or because I think it's so difficult, and I can't imagine being a carer for a parent with mental health issues. My dad, fortunately, has been well for 20 years on his medication.
Okay.
So there's that one issue. I think if you're like me, or like how I was anyway, and you're going through it and you're a teenager and you don't understand why your parent is the way they are, there's a lot kind of that can help now that wasn't available to me back then. Firstly, we've got the internet, but I would recommend kind of reaching out to any support groups for teenagers. I think Mind might do some. I'm not 100%, but I know there's Young Minds as well, the charity that focuses on teenagers. And just make sure you prioritize time for you, care for yourself, and know that it's not your fault, that this is just something that is happening to your parent, and it's not deliberate, but it's not on purpose, and there is support out there and there is help.
Yes. Yeah. You're not to blame for it. It's nothing that you did. I think that's great, and it's a good segue to, or going back to, recognizing this in yourself, recognizing when you start to feel a bit upset and anxious and that kind of thing. What are some of the things that teenage girls can look for? Not only, recognizing these things in a parent or a guardian, but looking for when they start feeling anxious. Is it important to talk about it? What can they do if they start to become concerned that they've got some issues with emotional and mental well-being?
It depends on how severe it is. I think if, for example, they're experiencing symptoms of depression and anxiety and all of that, the first port of call for anyone is your GP. So go to see your doctor in confidence if possible. It's difficult, I think, when you're under 18 because sometimes they will ask for sort of parental permission for medication and things like that. But I think the first step is, if you're really, really struggling, is going to your doctor and kind of getting that support. So you might sort of be prescribed medicine. They might refer you for therapy. But the one thing that I have noticed is that CAMHS is so stretched. It's so overstretched. CAMHS is the Children Adolescent Mental Health Service. There's waiting lists for a lot in the NHS. So I found, for myself, that I had to do private therapy, but it's not an option for everyone. So I would say there's a lot of very good things these days. I don't know if you've heard of the Headspace app, which is a meditation app, which I love and I think is great for teenagers as well, because you can download it on your phone and it teaches you meditation for like 10-minute meditations and breathing. So that if you have anxiety or depression, it can be quite good. But I would say the most important thing is to talk about how you're feeling and to share it with someone that you trust, because the worst thing you can do is bottle it up and then you'll get worse and you'll feel worse. And I think if someone is at crisis point, so if they're self-harming, as mentioned, or if they're feeling suicidal, there are things in place. I know there's the crisis team, the mental health teams. You know, people might need hospitalization if they get to that point, which is difficult as a teenager, but there is a lot of support out there, and also from mental health charities. So I would say counselling and see your doctor and just do what you can. Really, it can be a challenging time.
Yeah, it's all really good advice, and I think the key thing that you said was talk about it. Otherwise, it can exacerbate. It can be overwhelming. But this does lead to one of the parts of your work that's very important, and that's the stigmas. You know, when you have these issues, there's always a chance that you're going to recognize that you're feeling upset and you're feeling stressed, but you don't want to talk about it because you're in denial, because you don't want to deal with the stigmas. Do you have any advice for teenage girls who might find themselves in this position?
Yeah. When I was a teenager back in 2004, the stigma was huge. There were no blogs, no support groups for teenagers. I felt completely in the dark. That has changed rapidly now. There is still a stigma against mental illness, and teenagers can be particularly cruel. People at school might call you crazy. They might say horrible things. I know that me personally, there were rumors spread about me when I was hypomanic and I wasn't well at all, and I had rumours that went round, and that's just unfortunately teenagers not understanding. What I would say is that, tell somebody that you trust. Hopefully you'll have a trusted friend or someone that will understand. And now we're much more educated on mental health. There's still a long way to go to battle that stigma, particularly if you have something like myself, you've got bipolar or you've got schizophrenia, because psychosis, for example, is still not understood. There's still a stigma about it. Even self-harm, I think, with the survey today, as you said, there is that stigma. People look at, scars and they don't understand it. They just think, what on earth is that person doing? So I would say try just to talk. Like I said, it's really important to talk about it, but give yourself time. I think for me, it took me many years before I came to terms with the diagnosis of my illness. And I only started really talking about it, I would say about 3-4 years ago openly. I talked about it with friends and family, but now I obviously write and I do a lot more. And that's because I think just the benefit of experience and age. And so I think as a teenager, it's just important to, keep yourself well and focus on yourself. And then once you do that, then you can focus on tackling that stigma as well.
Yeah, it's really a big deal. Talk to us a little bit about why it's important to get a diagnosis, and after you actually get one, what's life like then? What does that mean? I mean, does it mean that you're on your way to managing this, coping with this? Is there a belief that some sort of way you can be cured? I think there's just a lot of information that is misinformation and a lot of myths, and it would be really quite nice to have some clarification on it.
Okay, my diagnosis happened as a result of necessity. I was very ill. I had 3 episodes in 1 year, and I ended up in hospital, and it was there that the doctor looked at what had happened. They looked at my family history with my dad, and they said, "We think you've got this." So at the time, I was only 16. So to be given, the label of bipolar affective disorder is a chronic illness, you're going to have to take medication for the rest of your life. You're going to, there's no cure. This is what you have. It was very hard for me to accept in my teen years that this would be a lifelong thing. And it is hard. I think some people, I've come across in my mental health work that they will get a diagnosis, but they don't necessarily agree with the diagnosis. Okay. So For me, it was important because I felt that it was the right diagnosis. Over the years, I was taking lots of different medicines, and I was actually relatively well, for about 10 years. For me, it was in some ways easier to accept it because I could see that the medicine was helping me. But there's many people that have multiple diagnoses as well, and that can be challenging. But for me, I found that giving it a name and learning about it, and having my dad, who was now well and could support me through it and could say, this is how I felt. How are you feeling, Ellie? How's everything going? To have that support from my dad was very helpful. The other challenges of diagnosis, I think, is that some families, there will be a stigma. So say you get diagnosed with something chronic, like bipolar or schizophrenia, the family could always turn around and say, well, you're crazy, or you're this, or you're that, and not everybody understands. So I would say it's important to see if you identify with that diagnosis, and if you do, then taking medicine and having therapy is so important in keeping yourself well.
That's really key, learning about it. I think that with any illness or anything that one's dealing with, but particularly because sometimes I think with mental and emotional health, it can be more elusive. You have this sort of concrete thing with physical that you can see and that you know about. And sometimes it's a little bit tricky for people. But I think it was so important what you said about learning about it as much as you can. Again, we talked about some of the things that people can do, what you can do yourself as a teenage girl if you're dealing with emotional and mental illness. But I want to talk a little bit about, but I want to talk a little bit more about what parents, guardians, schools can do to help with this rising problems, because I think, again, I said they're heavy hearts across the nation, and we all want to sort of get in there and do what we can. And I came across this brilliant, I thought, idea where in Missouri in the United States, they have something called the Be the Difference campaign by the National Council for Behavioral Health and the Missouri Department of Mental Health. And they're sharing information with schools on mental health and substance use challenges youth are facing, and helping to get frontline youth support trained in mental health first aid. So in a way, what they're trying to do is to eliminate some of the stigmas by putting it out there so that it's not just one student who's feeling isolated or ostracized if something happens. It sounds like an idea that seems to be working there. Are there things that you know of here that parents, guardians, schools, can do to sort of bring more attention to the rising issue amongst teenagers?
Yeah, there's a lot going on, I know, in schools particularly at the moment. My friend, the mental health campaigner, Johnny Benjamin, MBE, who did the documentary The Stranger on the Bridge, he has schizoaffective disorder, and he and the guy that saved him from suicide go into schools and they talk to teenagers, and they share their experiences, of being low and suicidal and how to get through that. So there are campaigners out there definitely that are going into schools, and schools are beginning to be more receptive to campaigners. I also know Hope Virgo, who is an anorexia survivor, and she also goes in and shares her story about eating disorders, which for teen girls is so important. Also teen boys as well. I think the project in Missouri sounds really interesting. I think that mental health education is beginning to become on the agenda. We know that with the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, they launched a program in primary schools for mental health education, which they're rolling out across the nation. But I do think that more needs to be done in secondary schools. In fact, I would say it needs to be on the curriculum. These things need to be taught about in a sensitive way, because obviously as a teenager, if you're learning about this stuff, it can trigger you if you're going through something yourself. I think parents are going to be really worried, but the best thing parents can do is listen to their kids non-judgmentally, is not pressure their child into saying, I'm self-harming, but be calm, because the calmer that you are, the calmer the child with mental illness will be. I think if you get angry or if you get heightened, they're going to feel that, and they won't open up to you. I heard this morning on the radio, there was a mother saying that she monitors her daughter's phone, and she found, her daughter sending self-harm images. So I think it's important for parents to be aware of what's going on, but there's also, issues with the mental health services being overstretched. So I think that's where schools come in with education.
Yeah, it sounds like all the different segments of community, of society, all the different aspects of it make up our lives. And so if we can do what we can at home, if we can do what we can in schools, if we can do what we can, whether it's in our social activities and so forth and so on, and sounds like some really great things are starting to take off. We're growing, we're getting there. And thank you so much to you and the people that you mentioned. I think you said Hope and Johnny and all of the people who've dealt with major issues who've decided to come out and share that information. I do find that your stories are relatable to them because you're still very young. I think they can listen and understand anything. But when young adults stand up and say, this is what's happened to me, it makes a big difference in terms of hearing. Are there any more tips that you feel that you can offer to, or that you want to? You've given us such great tips and advice for teenage girls for managing their emotional and mental well-being. I
think there's a few things. It's hard for me to sort of say this because I love social media. I think if you're in a vulnerable place, don't go on social media too much. I'm not saying don't use it at all, but I'd say, there are communities that encourage self-harm behavior or other things like that, and I think that can be harmful. It's also harmful to people's body image if they're looking at people, celebrities like the Kardashians the whole time. That's the perfect image. I have to look like that. That's really hard. But I think, as I said before, the most important thing is to be open, and it's difficult, I think, if you're in a family where there is the stigma against mental illness, because a lot of people grew up with that stigma and absorbed it from their parents, and it passes down. So I think I was lucky to grow up in a household where my parents, we talked about mental illness and they said, it's all right, you've got depression, but that's okay. We're going to get you better. I don't think, everyone has that. So I would say reach out to someone you trust.
Okay.
Also, the Samaritans have a free helpline. I regularly recommend to people that come to me with issues to speak to the Samaritan helpline because they listen non-judgmentally. It's free.
That's fantastic. Before we get out of here, I happen to know that you've got a secret, but you've got something very special coming up. Can you tell us about it?
I do, yeah. I recently signed a book contract with Trigger Publishing.
That's amazing.
Who are the publishing arm of the mental health charity, the Shaw Mind Foundation. And my book is coming out hopefully next year. So I'm writing it at the moment, and it's about my life story, from teenage years to now, age 30, with bipolar disorder and how I overcame certain challenges to find recovery. So I hope that my book will kind of provide some hope for anyone struggling with bipolar or depression or anxiety or psychosis, any mental illness. And so I'm really excited to be writing that.
Thank you so much. I mean, that is so inspirational and wonderful for you to share as you have already been, but to be able to put that in a book, that is really encouraging and inspirational and provides much hope for teenage girls and all teenagers. Thank you so much for talking to us today, Eleanor.
Thank you for having me.
That is a wrap for UIO on Undiagnosed Mental Illness. Very inspirational show with Eleanor Segall. Great advice to call the Samaritans when you need help. The telephone number is 116-123. That's for the UK and Ireland. Thank you, girls, for listening, and thank you, God, for the opportunity to do the show. Today, I want to pray for the complex topic of mental illness for girls everywhere. Not only do I pray that girls will recognize mental illness for what it is, see it as a health and well-being problem, realize that suffering aimlessly is not the norm, but also I pray for intervention and, when possible, in society, including homes, schools, government, religious entities, and so on. My prayers for happier, healthier mental and emotional well-being for all teenagers. I ask these blessings in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Tune in 2 weeks for the next episode of UIO for some straight talk with entrepreneur and barrister Hannah Lee Fish on rising above odds. Meanwhile, hit me up on Twitter at Sonja Lewis, Instagram at Sonja D. Lewis, Facebook on thisandthat.co.uk. Tell me what you want to hear about on UIO and keep sending those questions on any of the episodes. Take care of you inside out, and remember, it is UIO.